The night the rain wouldn't stop, the HOA was still sending out fine notices. While water climbed the sidewalks and emergency lights flashed in the distance, residents were being warned about unpaid fees and non-compliance.
No safety update. No evacuation plan. Just rules and penalties.
By morning, cars were ruined, homes were flooded, and one truth was impossible to ignore: this disaster wasn't just caused by the storm. It was caused by choices.
Choices made long before the first drop of rain fell. And when the water finally receded, the neighborhood was left asking a dangerous question: who was really responsible?
Before the storm ever appeared on a weather map, life in the neighborhood felt predictably calm. The streets were clean, the lawns evenly trimmed, and the sense of order was exactly what drew people in. It was the kind of place where families waved from driveways, evening walks felt safe, and the biggest concern seemed to be whether trash bins were rolled back in time. For anyone passing through, it looked like a community that had everything under control. The homeowner at the center of this story had moved in believing that sense of structure meant protection. The HOA fees were high, but they were explained as a necessary investment in safety, maintenance, and long-term stability.
At first, that promise seemed real. Common areas were spotless, newsletters arrived like clockwork, and reminders about rules came wrapped in polite, professional language.
Nothing felt threatening. It felt organized. But small signs of imbalance appeared early. Minor violations were enforced aggressively, while larger concerns quietly lingered. A warning letter over a parked car appeared faster than a response to repeated maintenance requests. Residents learned quickly that attention flowed in one direction, downward. Rules were visible, firm, and constant.
Accountability was not.
The neighborhood itself sat near an aging drainage channel, one that ran behind several homes and bordered the community.
Most people didn't think much about it at first. It had been there for years, and it was easy to assume someone, somewhere, was responsible for keeping it safe. But during heavier rainfalls, the water rose higher than expected. Small overflows became routine enough to notice, but never serious enough to cause panic. Concerns were raised quietly at first. A few emails. A couple of questions at meetings. Nothing dramatic. The responses were always calm, carefully worded, and reassuring without offering solutions. Repairs were labeled under review. Costs were described as not currently justified. The focus, instead, stayed locked on compliance, fees, deadlines, and appearance standards that mattered more than the unseen risks building behind the houses. Despite this, daily life continued. Children played outside. Neighbors planned weekends. Bills were paid. Most residents believed that if something truly dangerous existed, it would be addressed. That belief created comfort, and comfort created silence. What no one realized yet was that the calm wasn't stability. It was delay. And while the HOA concentrated on control and revenue, the real problem kept growing quietly, waiting for the moment it would no longer be possible to ignore. What followed the first serious rainfall was not concern from the HOA, but control. Within days, enforcement notices began arriving more frequently than weather updates. What had once felt like routine reminders now carried sharper language and shorter deadlines. Late fees increased. Courtesy warnings disappeared. Every interaction felt less like community management and more like pressure. The homeowner at the center of this story began noticing a pattern. Requests about drainage safety were acknowledged politely, then buried under compliance demands. Emails about rising water levels were answered with references to bylaws. Photos of erosion were met with reminders about unpaid balances or minor violations. It was as if every safety concern triggered retaliation. The HOA's presence grew heavier. Inspections happened without warning. Notes were left on doors. Vehicles were photographed. Small technicalities were suddenly enforced with absolute precision. A trash bin left out an hour too long. A fence panel leaning slightly after heavy rain. Temporary repairs misclassified as unapproved modifications. Each violation carried a fine. Each fine carried urgency. And each notice arrived with the same message beneath the surface: focus on what we care about, not what you fear.
As rainstorms continued, so did the damage. Water pooled closer to homes. The drainage channel overflowed more frequently, cutting through yards and leaving behind mud and debris. Neighbors started sharing stories quietly: basements damp, foundations cracking, insurance adjusters asking uncomfortable questions. Still, the HOA's budget meetings told a different story. Monthly reports emphasized financial health. Reserve funds were described as stable. Spending priorities highlighted aesthetic improvements. Decorative projects were approved while maintenance discussions were postponed. Safety remained a future concern, always just beyond the current agenda. Frustration grew, but so did caution. Residents understood the power imbalance. Challenging the HOA meant risking liens, legal threats, or worse. Many stayed silent, hoping the problem would resolve itself or that someone else would push back. After a particularly heavy storm left standing water inches from several front doors, a group of homeowners submitted a formal request for inspection. It was respectful, detailed, and supported by evidence. The response came quickly and coldly. The HOA declined the request, citing cost concerns. The same message announced a new round of compliance checks and reminded residents that unauthorized communication with external agencies could result in penalties. That line changed everything. It made clear that the HOA wasn't just ignoring the risk. It was actively discouraging attention. Soon after, enforcement intensified. Fines arrived weekly. Payments were demanded with escalating urgency. Notices referenced vague clauses and discretionary authority. Every step felt designed to exhaust, intimidate, and isolate. The homeowner began documenting everything. Dates, emails, notices, budget summaries. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Safety requests coincided with enforcement spikes. Complaints were followed by inspections. The message was unmistakable: compliance would be rewarded, resistance punished. As tension spread through the neighborhood, so did fear. Some neighbors paid fines they couldn't afford just to avoid trouble. Others stopped speaking up entirely. A few quietly prepared to move, deciding it was easier to leave than fight. Then came the storm that changed the tone from frustration to urgency. Forecasts warned of sustained rainfall. Alerts escalated. The drainage channel, already compromised, showed visible strain. Water levels rose faster than before. Residents watched nervously, waiting for some acknowledgement from the HOA. It never came. Instead, an email arrived reminding homeowners of outstanding balances and warning that failure to comply could result in legal action. No emergency plan. No guidance. No acknowledgement of the growing danger. That night, rain fell without pause. Water spilled over the channel's edge and rushed into streets. Yards disappeared. Cars stalled. Homes took on water faster than anyone could respond. Panic spread as residents tried to protect what they could, realizing too late how vulnerable they were. And when the storm finally slowed, the damage was undeniable. Homes were flooded. Property was destroyed. Insurance questions went unanswered. Residents looked for leadership and found enforcement instead. Within hours, compliance notices resumed. Debris removal deadlines were issued. Appearance standards were emphasized. Fines were threatened for visible damage that homeowners had no control over. The HOA framed the disaster as an inconvenience, not a failure. That response ignited something deeper than anger. It created resolve. Neighbors who had never spoken before began sharing records. Emails surfaced showing ignored warnings. Budget documents revealed deferred maintenance. The timeline painted a picture that felt intentional rather than accidental. As pressure mounted, the HOA doubled down. Emergency assessments were announced. Payments were demanded to restore community standards. Those who questioned the charges were warned about liens. The homeowner realized this was no longer about one rule or one storm. It was about power. About an organization that valued control and revenue over safety, accountability, and trust. And just as residents began to consider what fighting back might look like, the HOA made its most aggressive move yet, one that would push the conflict beyond the neighborhood and into public view. Because the next notice didn't just demand money. It threatened everything the homeowners thought they owned. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The moment everything broke open did not arrive with shouting or chaos. It arrived with exposure. By the time the HOA scheduled what they called an emergency compliance review, the neighborhood was already fractured. Homes were still drying out. Walls were stripped. Furniture sat curbside like quiet evidence of failure. And yet, the HOA's tone remained rigid, procedural, almost coldly administrative. Notices continued. Deadlines tightened. Liens were prepared behind closed doors. It felt less like recovery and more like punishment. The homeowner realized this was the final stage of the pressure campaign. The HOA wasn't trying to fix anything. It was trying to outlast resistance. But what the board didn't understand was that fear had already burned away. What remained was clarity. Weeks of documentation came together in a single timeline. Every ignored warning. Every deferred repair. Every budget reallocation that favored appearance over safety. Every enforcement spike that followed a complaint. When viewed separately, each decision looked defensible. When seen together, they revealed something darker, a consistent pattern of control prioritized over protection. The climax arrived not in the neighborhood, but beyond it. Regulatory agencies became involved. Insurance investigators asked questions the HOA couldn't deflect. Municipal engineers inspected the drainage system and confirmed what residents had feared all along: the failure point was known, preventable, and documented. Responsibility could no longer be blurred by technical language. As pressure mounted, the HOA attempted to shield itself. Statements were issued emphasizing authority. Legal language replaced reassurance. Responsibility was shifted outward to weather, to residents, to ambiguity. But the narrative no longer belonged to them. When financial records were audited, the truth became unavoidable. Funds intended for infrastructure had been rerouted repeatedly. Risk assessments had been dismissed as unnecessary expenses. Safety concerns were downgraded while cosmetic upgrades were approved. The storm didn't create the disaster. It exposed it. The HOA's final move was its most aggressive. Liens were formally initiated against several homeowners, including the one who had documented the most evidence. It was meant to be the ultimate show of power, a reminder of who controlled the rules, the penalties, and the future. Instead, it became the trigger. Legal intervention followed swiftly. The liens were challenged. Oversight bodies demanded explanations. The same discretion the HOA had relied on for years was now scrutinized line by line. Authority that once felt absolute began to collapse under the weight of accountability. Public attention amplified the consequences. What had been an internal dispute transformed into a case study of negligence and overreach. The HOA's leadership, once insulated by paperwork and procedure, now faced the reality that governance without responsibility carries consequences. The turning point was unmistakable. The HOA's power fractured the moment it could no longer operate in isolation. Emergency assessments were frozen. Enforcement actions were halted. The board's decisions were placed under review. What residents had been told for years was unquestionable authority was suddenly revealed to be conditional, fragile, and deeply flawed. For the homeowner, the climax was not about victory. It was about validation. The fear that once kept everyone quiet was replaced by proof. Proof that the warnings were real. Proof that the damage was preventable. Proof that power, when misused, eventually exposes itself. As the HOA's leadership retreated into legal defenses and delayed statements, the neighborhood stood at a crossroads. The structures of control were still standing, but their legitimacy was gone. And as the dust settled, one truth became clear: the storm had passed, but the reckoning had just begun. The resolution did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, the way accountability often does after years of avoidance. Once external oversight stepped in, the HOA's familiar rhythm of enforcement and intimidation came to a halt. Notices stopped appearing on doors. Fine deadlines quietly expired. Emails that once arrived with sharp urgency were replaced by silence. For the first time since the neighborhood began unraveling, nothing new was being demanded from the residents. That silence spoke louder than any announcement ever had. Oversight reviews continued behind the scenes, and their presence reshaped the balance of power almost immediately. The HOA could no longer act unilaterally. Decisions that had once been pushed through with vague references to authority now required justification. Documentation mattered. Timelines mattered. Patterns mattered. And the pattern that emerged was impossible to ignore. The drainage failure was formally classified as preventable. Reports confirmed that routine maintenance and modest reinforcement would have reduced the damage significantly. Budget records showed that funds allocated for infrastructure had been repeatedly redirected, not out of necessity, but preference. Appearance had been prioritized because it was visible. Safety had been postponed because its absence was easy to deny until it wasn't. As these findings surfaced, the HOA's position weakened further. Emergency assessments were permanently canceled. Liens were withdrawn. Homeowners who had already paid fines tied to flood-related compliance were refunded or credited. What had once felt like an untouchable system of penalties and rules began to reverse itself. The leadership that had defined the HOA for years could not survive the exposure. Board members resigned one by one, some quietly, others defensively. The structure remained, but its authority had been stripped down to what it should have been all along: service, not control. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways that went far beyond policy. Repairs finally began on the drainage system. Not cosmetic patches, but real structural work. Engineers assessed vulnerabilities. Reinforcements were installed. Water flow was redirected and monitored. These changes weren't flashy. There were no banners or announcements celebrating them. But every resident noticed the difference when the next heavy rain arrived and passed without incident. Insurance claims moved forward with clarity instead of confusion. Homeowners rebuilt without the constant fear of retaliation. For many families, the emotional relief mattered as much as the financial recovery. The anxiety that had lingered for years, the feeling of being watched, measured, and punished, slowly lifted. The HOA elections that followed were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Participation surged. Transparency became a priority. Financial reports were simplified and shared openly. Safety assessments were scheduled regularly instead of being buried under aesthetic discussions. For the first time, residents felt like stakeholders rather than liabilities. But the impact extended beyond governance. People who had once avoided eye contact now spoke openly. Neighbors helped each other with repairs, recommendations, and planning. The flood, destructive as it had been, had forced a collective awakening. It reminded everyone that communities are not maintained by rules alone, but by responsibility and trust. The most lasting change was internal. Residents who had once doubted themselves, who had wondered if they were overreacting, if they were the problem, found validation. The fear of pushing back had been replaced by a deeper understanding of their rights. The realization settled in quietly but firmly: authority is not the same as correctness, and compliance does not equal consent. The HOA still existed, but it no longer ruled through intimidation. Its power was now visible, accountable, and limited. And that limitation made it stronger in the ways that actually mattered. Time passed. Lawns recovered. Houses were repaired. Life resumed its normal pace. But the story of what happened never fully faded. New residents were told carefully, almost like a warning passed forward. Not to discourage them but to prepare them. Because the lesson wasn't just about one storm or one board. It was about what happens when systems meant to protect people begin protecting themselves instead. It was about how easily structure can slide into control when no one questions it. And it was about how quickly that control collapses when reality forces a reckoning. The flood did what years of emails and meetings could not.
It stripped away the illusion that order alone equals safety. It revealed that rules without accountability are just tools of convenience. And it proved that silence, while comfortable in the short term, carries a cost that eventually comes due. In the end, the neighborhood did not win because it was louder or stronger. It won because it documented, persisted, and refused to accept fear as a permanent condition. The power imbalance didn't disappear overnight, but it was corrected through exposure and collective resolve. And that is the part that lingers. Because every HOA, every neighborhood authority, and every rule-bound system operates on the same fragile assumption that people will tolerate inconvenience, unfairness, and risk as long as it feels easier than resistance. Until it isn't. So the question that remains isn't about floods or fines or failed drainage systems. It's about something far more universal. When authority stops protecting you and starts testing how much you'll endure, how long will you stay quiet before you demand better?